Coming up, years after a conflict in Ethiopia killed hundreds of thousands of people, markets are bustling again, factories and banks are open, and roads are being rebuilt. But the country is increasingly susceptible to climate shocks, with the UN warning that millions now need farming assistance. Europe's Iberian lynx is making a comeback decades after the feline's figures fell because of habitat loss and hunting. And agriculture feeds everyone on the planet, but there's still major contention over the way livestock are reared.
Does PETA have recommendations even on how animals should be treated before they're slaughtered?
So that's a difficult one because, as you say, we don't think that animals should be slaughtered.
Emissions and waste are also an increasingly controversial issue, with some producers keen to clean up their act.
Farmers would dearly love to use fewer pesticides because that means they get less exposed to toxic products and they have lower expenses.
Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
what are your thoughts on the only way to make a farm sustainable is to not engage in livestock farming at all?
Oh dear.
growing inequality, conflict, and the climate crisis all contribute to daily hunger for millions of children. According to the UN, 25% of kids under the age of 5 have little access to the nutritious food needed to develop. And they're more than 50% likely to suffer a life-threatening form of malnutrition known as wasting. A UNICEF report looked at underfed youth in nearly 100 countries. Researchers say less than 10% of young people get the fruits and veggies their body needs, and less than 5% get proteins from sources like eggs or meat. The report adds that the majority of those suffering reside in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And it is set to worsen for countries like Ethiopia, where drought parches cropland. 80% of the population, or more than 98 million Ethiopians, rely on agriculture for food and income. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization warns that economic breakdown, armed conflicts and climate shocks have put 13 million in dire need of farming assistance. The report recommends 175 million in funds to help the most vulnerable by enhancing crop production, productivity, protections for livestock, and renewing animal health facilities.
The African Development Bank Group and the government of Ethiopia, in partnership with others, have launched a project to develop the country's wheat industry. Financing will support 500,000 smallholder farmers in the Ethiopian states of Afar, Amhara, Omoria, and Somali. And of course, this is to increase wheat productivity from 3 to 4 tons per hectare based on the scripting. So, are you confident, though, that this money will trickle down to farmers and that there'll be a transparent distribution process?
Sure. Most of because Ethiopia is working for food security at national level and at the household level, because we are working seriously on that. Even the result shows that even if you see now in Ethiopian lands, even around rivers or irrigations are available, even underground waters are available. We are working on which with the support of development, African Development Bank. So it is serious. It is a leadership agendas and expertise agendas.
በህዝባችን ብቻ ሳይሆን በርከት ያሉ አመራሮች ይህን ሐሳብ ተጋርተው ለመስራት ተቸግረው ነበር። ነገር ግን ሶማሌ ክልል በእርሻ ማናቀው ክልል ሳይቀር ለማመን በሚቸግር ደረጃ ስንዴን በዘመናዊ መንገድ ማረስ ማምረት መብላት ብቻ ሳይሆን ለመሸጥ የሚያበቃ
Ethiopia's government was at war with elements of the northern Tigray region for 2 years that started in November 2020. What impacts did the conflict have on local agriculture?
Amazingly, surprisingly, at conflict areas also there is an agricultural production, the productivity or agricultural work is still now. It has not stopped. Farmers are working. Even if you look for our current data or our recent years data also, it is increasing from time to time. Maybe the conflict areas are, most of the time, on the day, there are anti-government groups. On the day, they are not available. They may come at during night. So on the day, the farmers are working on their field. At night, they will be at their home. So the government can manage. Not only that, in Ethiopia, we have extension workers at village level. We have about 18,000 extension workers at village level, agricultural extension workers at village level to serve that farmers. So daily they serve the farmers, then they back to their home. So it is not this much affect the agricultural practices in Ethiopia.
Across the African continent, I understand there's a crisis of getting nutrient-rich food to the population. For example, I know there's aggressive marketing of cheap, ultra-processed food and sugar-sweetened beverages in some countries in Africa. Do you think this is a big problem in Ethiopia?
In Ethiopia, the problem, economic crisis is not only for Ethiopia or for Africa. It is a world problem or global problem. But Ethiopia is working for the success. For example, we haven't imported any wheat or any food items from neighbors. So we are compensating these economic issues or economic problem issues. But I think in Ethiopia is best for if you compare it with other countries, because even I saw some African countries' agriculture practices, even their incomes, when I compare with Ethiopia's own transition.
Across the world, extreme weather is damaging horticulture and livestock farming through floods, dry spells, and fires. And these events are increasing in frequency, making it difficult and in some cases impossible to recover what's been lost. It may seem ironic, some say the planet is retaliating for the massive greenhouse gas emissions that come from the industry. But the argument continues about elements of farming that are particularly damaging to the environment and the need to change our consumption habits from one that fells trees and pollutes the soil and water to a system of regeneration with little to no impact on the natural world. The farmers would ultimately, like most of us, like to continue making a living, but they aren't tone deaf on the issue, with some of them trying to delve into sustainability. One chicken farmer in Paris who wants to reduce his farm's carbon footprint is aiming to produce the best meat with the least amount of feed possible. And to find out which animal protein is the best option, Pierre-Marie Aubert is advising that we not focus solely on carbon.
Il ne faut pas se concentrer que sur le carbone. En fait, la production animale, elle touche à l'usage des terres, donc à l'ensemble des paysages dans lesquels on vit. Elle touche évidemment aux émissions de carbone. Elle touche à la gestion des ressources naturelles, l'eau, le sol. Et donc, pour savoir finalement qu'est-ce qu'on doit consommer, il faut regarder tout ça. Si on regarde que le carbone, on va faire une erreur d'appréciation.
It is accurate that the carbon footprint deals with a lot more than just CO2. But what does producing the best meat really mean? Some companies advertise that their meat and eggs are produced from animals that were grass-fed and pasture-raised, i.e. organic. Is that better for the environment, or do free-range animals mean higher emissions because more trees and land need to be cleared to raise them? Meanwhile, a lot has been said about just how dangerous too much water vapor, carbon dioxide and methane are to the atmosphere, but we know a lot less about nitrous oxide. Emissions from the gas are soaring, which is why efforts are underway to fully understand where it comes from and how we can avoid releasing more of it.
50 or so cows nibble on New Zealand's Canterbury Plains, building up strength for the milking season. But this is no ordinary farm. Beneath these green meadows, a research laboratory measures just how much of an impact the herd has on the environment.
We can draw some gases from the different depth of the soil to measure, for example, at what depth nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas is produced.
Nitrous oxide is naturally emitted by microscopic organisms that act on nitrogen in soil. And during joint studies, scientists from New Zealand and China have discovered one of them.
I aim to apply these findings to soil improvement in China. Even a small discovery could potentially have significant impact.
The microbe, which researchers say is unique to New Zealand, is a significant find considering the potency of nitrous oxide, a gas that's 300 times more powerful at heating up the planet than carbon dioxide, and more urgently, one whose density has increased in the atmosphere by 20% over the last 150 years. Comprehensive research on the microbe is important to New Zealand. The country is keen to meet its climate targets, a formidable challenge considering its dairy industry earns billions annually in exports. And China, New Zealand's largest meat and milk market, and who's looking to ramp up its own exports, benefits from the findings too.
A lot of it's about producing food in a sustainable fashion that is kind and to the environment with low environmental impact. And those are things that we can probably learn from each other as we advance our food production systems.
New Zealand and China will continue research on technologies that improve traditional farming methods, with more than 30 young scientists monitoring how soil samples react to fertilizer and cow manure.
I spoke with Patrick Worms, a senior policy advisor at the World Agroforestry Center, about what farmers want, what they need, and are willing to do when it comes to protecting the environment.
The best way of thinking about sustainable farming is not that we maintain wherever we are today, because we can't do that. Current farming practices have degraded soils, they emit lots of greenhouse gas emissions, they consume too much water. They're just not very good at what they are doing. They're just good at one thing, which is producing lots of stuff. So instead, I prefer to talk about regenerative farming. And regenerative farming is not a set of practices. Regenerative farming is something you do to meet a better world. You start with the farming practices as they are today, and you think about how you can improve these farming practices to improve your soil quality, for example, or increase your resilience to extreme weather events, or reduce your dependency on toxic inputs, or reduce the cost of the inputs or the fertilizers you have to buy. And every year you get a little bit better. And if you have that mental attitude that you're going to improve your farming system over time, holistically, not just looking at your bank account, not just looking at productivity, but looking at the state of your soil, at your water function, at your greenhouse gas emissions, at the carbon you're locking down, at the biodiversity you're hosting, then you're going to be making progress.
Can you just talk about what you've generally seen farmers do incorrectly on their farms that hurt the environment?
Now, farmers are not making mistakes, but farmers are being encouraged to make mistakes that benefit certain interests. For example, in most of the world, the advice that farmers get comes from people who are being paid to sell those farmers inputs, fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides or irrigation systems or what have you. And when you speak to farmers, what they very often tell you is, Patrick, I want impartial advice, because most farmers realize that the cheapest and most effective way of improving their farming practice is to change the way they manage things, your soil, the water, the plants, the animals.
So then what do you think about the EU's Green Deal, which lots of farmers are against, in part because it's very complicated and expensive?
Farmers, if you talk to farmers, as opposed to listening to the propaganda in the media, you realize that farmers are not against the Green Deal as such. Farmers know that pesticides are toxic. They use them. Farmers know that pesticides are expensive. They use them. Farmers would dearly love to use fewer pesticides, because that means they get less exposed to toxic products and they have lower expenses. They don't mind any of that. What they do mind is the lack of trust that the current agricultural system in Europe displays towards them.
What are your thoughts on the only way to make a farm sustainable and avoid the harmful land and water use, deforestation, harmful pesticides, and toxic waste from animals is to not engage in livestock farming at all?
Oh dear. Well, look at any ecosystem and it contains animals. There is no ecosystem that only contains plants. A good farming system is a farming system that mimics ecosystemic processes, because it's cheaper to let the ecosystem take care of something than to have to spray a chemical to do it instead, right? That means that the best farming systems all integrate animals. Now, that doesn't mean you have to eat those animals at the end of it. but personally, I happen to eat them. So the trick is not that animals are bad or livestock is bad. The trick is that the way we currently raise livestock is terrible. Right now, livestock is being raised in extremely intensive systems, and that generates an enormous amount of negative externalities. But that's because they have been taken away from the land. They are not interacting with cropping land anymore. They're being kept in a separate system. And in that separate system, their manure is a problem, their methane emissions is a problem, animal welfare is a problem, and the amount of land they require to eat the wrong food that we're giving them, we're giving cereals to ruminants, it's completely crazy, is a problem as well. But when you integrate animals into your farming systems, your farming system becomes more efficient. The animals provide fertility. They provide, if you use them right, they replace plowing because of the way they manage the land. They increase your biodiversity. I have a friend who is a farmer who raises cattle, and his business model is to take completely destroyed pieces of land, restore them to his cattle. And when the biodiversity hits a certain target, which is measured by a university, he goes to the public authority and says, hey, this field now hits your target for a nature reserve. It's got the right level of bird diversity, of arthropod diversity, of grass diversity. So would you like to call it a nature reserve? And they said, yeah, of course, we'll like to call it a nature reserve. Good. Then you need to pay me to maintain your nature reserve on my land with my cattle. It's a beautiful business model, and it's a livestock-based one.
No doubt many of us feel better when we believe the animals we consume were raised in conditions that made them happy. Another irony considering the animal's eventual fate. So does ethical farming, a system that takes animal welfare into account, matter for environmental protection?
I know Peter's stance on the consumption of animals. I see all these social media posts quite often. Every animal that's been eaten, Peter says, these animals would like to have a full life and would not like to be eaten. But while we are still where we are, does Peter have recommendations even on how animals should be treated before they're slaughtered?
So that's a difficult one because, as you say, we don't think that animals should be slaughtered at all. They are not here for us. They should have their own lives. They have a value as well. Each one of them is an individual, like you and I, who wants to spend time in peace, without free of suffering, and not be taken to the slaughterhouse. As I was saying, there are degrees. So what we need to do is move away from the intensive farming model as a priority. The problem is many countries, such as France, for instance, are going the other direction. They're taking it much further and having these huge operations with thousands and thousands of animals cramped together, when really the government should be encouraging a switch to plant-based farming. So going in that direction, even if we are realistic, we know it's not going to happen tomorrow, but we can't be going backwards. We really need to be going towards this plant-based transition, which is even a recommendation from the United Nations for environmental reasons as well.
So on this episode, we talked a bit about the carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions from farms. I want to get your perspective, though, on two terms. Firstly, organic farms. What does that mean to Peter, specifically when it comes to animal farming?
Research has shown that a switch to all organic farming would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. And to come back to actually animal welfare, the conditions for animals in farms are very similar, whether it's organic or free range or supposedly high welfare or just traditional farming. And that is because animals are usually the vast majority of them are kept confined in dirty, dark sheds. Sometimes they suffer mutilations. They are separated from their mothers, and they are then sent to the slaughterhouse when they're very young to meet a terrifying and violent death.
So you don't believe those tags on certain foods that says organically produced?
The organic parts obviously can be believed, but I don't believe the labels that say high animal welfare or free range. Those don't mean very much in terms of the actual condition for the animals. So for instance, with free range, an animal can actually it can actually mean that they are just simply not caged, but they can be free ranging inside a shed. But they are packed by so many thousands of them that they can't actually move. So it doesn't make much of a change for them and for their living conditions. They're still suffering. A lot of them are bred so quickly that they can't even, their body weight, their bones will not sustain their body weight. So they suffer fractures. They can't even get to the food or the water, and they slowly starve to death. High welfare labels sadly cannot be trusted, because we've seen time and time again investigations showing. There's been a recent one by the group Animal Rising, which recently exposed 45 UK animal farms that were certified by the RSPCA Assured Scheme. They found widespread animal suffering, breaches of animal welfare law.
Small and medium farms that talk about treating animals with respect, love, and care, and say that they're ensuring that there are no environmental threats in the process. What are your thoughts on branding oneself as an ethical farmer?
I think it's very hard to call any type of farming ethical. I mean, as long as you're exploiting animals for profit and turning either their flesh or their secretions into a product that you will then sell, there's nothing ethical about it. If we take dairy farming, for instance, even if the cows are having let's say, a better life than if they were confined in sheds, they're still every year having a calf taken away from them shortly after birth. And these babies are either fattened or sent straight to the slaughterhouse for veal. And the mothers themselves, they have a very short and miserable life cycle, which ends as well in the slaughterhouse, where they are killed in a violent and terrifying manner. So ethical, the word ethical is very hard to apply to farming. There are potentially degrees in terms of intensive farming versus a smaller scale farm. But none of them, in PETA's view, can be deemed ethical.
At the turn of the century, one of the world's rarest cats, known as the Iberian lynx, teetered on the edge of extinction. Now, it's in the midst of a remarkable turnaround.
There is no other example all over the world of a species who was so critically endangered, who was on the really brink of extinction with less than 100 individuals, and in such a fast and strong recovery. And this,
as its name implies, this feline calls the Iberian Peninsula home, specifically Spain and Portugal. It faced near extinction in the 1960s due to habitat loss, state-sanctioned killings and disease, but dedicated conservation efforts, along with the release of captive lynxes, resulted in the population surging from 94 in 2002 to over 2,000 last year, prompting the International Union for Conservation of Nature to downgrade the cat status from endangered to vulnerable on the red list of threatened species.
Tell us about this good news and what this status downgrade means exactly.
Well, the downgrade of the Iberian lynx means that the Iberian lynx is moving a little bit forward in the good directions, not in the direction of the extinction, but in the direction of recovery as a species. And it's the second step. We have to consider when the starting point was something like 24 years ago at the beginning of this century, when a national census certified that the lynx was really at the brink of extinction. We have only 100 lynx all over the world, we say, in Spain and Portugal. And the IUCN said it was in critical endangered. And now, 24 years after, we moved 2 steps forward, and the lynx is being downgraded to vulnerable. That is the last step before taking it outside the threat.
Yeah, a lot of us saw images of a few lynx being released back into the wild in certain parts of Europe. Talk about what conditions were there for this status downgrade to happen.
Well, the first is that the population is growing very fast. In the last 2-3 years, for example, we have a rate of increasing of 20% of the population every year. And now we are about over the 2,000 individuals in the wild. That's a very good news also, because it means that the population is growing very well in natural conditions. We are supporting this growth of the population with the release of animals coming from captivity. We are releasing lynxes in those places where the rabbit population is very healthy, and we have very high density of rabbits, and that makes our life easier. No? But it's true that we are investing also a lot of efforts in knowing better the biology of the rabbit and trying to understand how we can guarantee that we have rabbits all over the territory and not only concentrated in Somalia. Because the lynx is a specialist, is just specialized in the diet. It's wild rabbits, and it needs the big abundance of wild rabbits to
That's all they
feed.
eat.
And yes, is what the 90% of the diet of these animals is wild rabbits. We still have some threats. We still have some animals, kids in the road because the population is expanding and it crosses different linear infrastructures like road, highways, and so on. And it's also killed by some crazy people that they still don't accept that the lynx is returning back in their territories, and for mistaking or just for bad choice they shoot to the animals. So we still have a certain mortality that we have to reduce in order to guarantee that the situation goes in a better way.
And that's our show. I guess it's only appropriate I leave you with images of some of the animals we've talked about on this episode and the conditions in which they live, which all contribute to deforestation, pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions.